welcome to the deep dive. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, and comment. It really does help this channel. Today, we're diving into a case that's captivated the nation for over a decade, the death of Kendrick Johnson. We have articles, investigative reports, court documents, a real mixed bag, you know. Our mission is to sift through all of this and try to make sense of the conflicting narratives, the evidence, and the lingering questions that surround this case. So if you're ready, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. I'm sure you've heard the basic story, but let's set the scene for our listener. Kendrick Johnson, a 17-year-old student-athlete, was found dead inside a rolled-up gym mat at Lowndes High School in Valdosta, Georgia.
Yeah, back in 2013. Officially, his death was ruled an accident, but his family never accepted that explanation. And to be honest, after going through the material you provided, even I'm having trouble understanding how the official story could be true.
Well, that's what we're here to explore. The evidence is complex and often contradictory, but by taking a closer look, we can start to see why this case has generated so much controversy.
Okay, so first things first. Who was Kendrick Johnson? Paint a picture for our listener.
Kendrick was, by all accounts, a typical teenager. He was a good student, a talented athlete who dreamed of playing professional football, and he was well-liked by his peers. His family describes him as a kind, loving young man with a bright future ahead of him. He was a son, a brother, a friend, someone whose life was tragically cut short.
So walk our listener through the day it all happened. What do we know for sure?
Kendrick went to school as usual on January 10th, 2013. He was seen on surveillance footage entering the gymnasium that afternoon, but was never seen leaving. When he didn't come home that evening, his family reported him missing. A search ensued, and tragically, his body was discovered the next morning, inside a vertically stored wrestling mat.
I remember seeing those photos in the news. It was horrifying. A young man headfirst in a mat, his shoes neatly placed on top. It just seemed so strange. The police, though, concluded he died accidentally from positional asphyxia, right?
Yes, the initial explanation was that Kendrick had climbed into the mat to retrieve a shoe and somehow got stuck, leading to his suffocation. However, many people, including Kendrick's family and independent investigators, have raised serious doubts about this theory.
Well, for starters, wouldn't it be almost impossible for someone of Kendrick's size to fit inside one of those mats, let alone get stuck head first?
That's one of the key arguments against the accidental death theory. The diameter of the mat was simply too small to accommodate someone of Kendrick's height and build, especially if he was trying to reach for a shoe. And the fact that his shoes were found on top of his body, inside the mat, further complicates this explanation.
Yeah, it's like something out of a movie. It just doesn't add up. What else doesn't quite fit with this accidental death theory?
Well, photos of Kendrick's body show severe swelling and discoloration of his face and hands, with blood around his nose and mouth. These injuries don't seem consistent with simple suffocation. They suggest a possible struggle, or even blunt force trauma.
And there was a pool of blood near the body that was never tested right.
That's right. The police dismissed it as not being Kendrick's blood, but they never actually bothered to test it to confirm. This raises questions about the thoroughness of the initial investigation.
It sounds like they were quick to jump to conclusions. But missing a detail like that, not even testing it, it just seems negligent.
It's definitely one of the many inconsistencies that fuels suspicion in this case. There are others too. For instance, the wrestling mat where Kendrick was found was stored upright, which wasn't standard practice. Was this intentional? If so, why?
Right. And we can't forget about the missing surveillance footage. There were key hours unaccounted for, conveniently surrounding Kendrick's disappearance.
Exactly. That's another major red flag. If the school had nothing to hide, wouldn't they have made sure all the footage was available? It's hard not to view this as a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth.
So we have a seemingly impossible accident, a lot of unexplained details, and potentially crucial evidence missing. What are we to make of all this?
Well, in the face of such uncertainty and so many unanswered questions, various theories have emerged to try and explain what happened to Kendrick. Some are more plausible than others, but they all reflect the deep distrust and suspicion that surround this case.
Okay, so let's dive into those theories. What are the main explanations people have put forward for Kendrick's death? We'll break those down after a quick word from our sponsors. But first, before we move on, I want to remind you all to please like, subscribe, and comment. It really does help this channel.
All right, so let's get back to those theories surrounding Kendrick's death. One of the most prominent is the cover-up theory.
This is the one that really grabs people's attention, isn't it? The idea that someone, maybe even connected to the school or local authorities, was involved in Kendrick's death and then worked to conceal the truth.
Exactly. And when you consider the missing surveillance footage, the untested blood, and the inconsistencies in the initial investigation, it's not hard to see why this theory has gained so much traction. It raises questions about who might have had the motive and the means to orchestrate such a cover-up, and why they would go to such lengths to protect whoever was responsible.
It's a disturbing thought for sure. What about the idea that Kendrick was involved in a fight at school before his death?
That's another theory that's been circulating. Some witnesses reported that Kendrick had been in disputes with other students in the past. The idea is that maybe a fight escalated leading to his death, and his body was hidden in the mat to conceal the crime.
But is there any concrete evidence to support this? Just rumors and hearsay wouldn't hold up in court, would they?
You're right. While the fight theory aligns with some witness statements, there's no direct evidence linking a specific individual to a fight with Kendrick on that day. Without a clear connection, it remains speculative.
It's tragic, but high school can be a tough environment. Kids get into disagreements, sometimes things go too far. But to jump from a possible fight to murder and a cover-up seems like a stretch, doesn't it?
It does, but it's important to remember that we're dealing with a case where the official explanation doesn't fully satisfy many people. In the absence of clear answers, people naturally seek alternative explanations, even if those explanations are difficult to prove.
Okay, so we have a possible cover-up and a possible fight. What other theories are out there?
Another theory that's been raised, and it's a particularly sensitive one, is the idea that Kendrick was targeted because of his race. He was one of the few black students at a predominantly white school, and some people believe that racial prejudice played a role in his death and the subsequent investigation.
That's a heavy accusation, and one that raises serious questions about the social dynamics and potential biases at play in this case. If true, it would be a horrifying example of injustice. But is there any evidence to suggest that Kendrick was specifically targeted because of his race?
It's difficult to say definitively without concrete proof. However, the theory gains some traction when you consider the historical context of racial injustice in this country, and the fact that the initial investigation was at best incomplete. Some people argue that if Kendrick had been a white student, the investigation would have been more thorough, and the possibility of foul play would have been taken more seriously.
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's certainly something worth considering. It reminds us that we can't ignore the larger societal forces that might be at play in a case like this. What about the official explanation, the accidental death theory? Does anyone still believe that?
While it's the official finding, the accidental death theory has been widely disputed. The evidence simply doesn't support the idea that Kendrick willingly climbed into a narrow, upright gym mat and got stuck. The physical constraints, the position of his body, and the later discovery of injuries inconsistent with suffocation all point to something more than a tragic accident.
So you're saying that even though the authorities maintain that this was an accident, the evidence just doesn't line up?
Exactly, and that's why this case continues to generate so much debate. People are looking for answers, and they're not satisfied with a theory that seems to ignore or downplay crucial pieces of evidence.
So we have these four theories, each with its own supporters and detractors. But the story doesn't end there, right? There were some pretty significant developments in the case after the initial investigation.
Absolutely. Some of these developments further challenged the official narrative and added even more fuel to the fire of speculation.
Okay, so let's unpack those developments. What happened after the initial investigation concluded that Kendrick's death was an accident? All right, so we've got these competing theories. But as you mentioned, there were some major developments that happened after the initial investigation wrapped up. What were some of the biggest bombshells that really shook things up?
Well, one of the most significant developments was the second autopsy, commissioned by Kendrick's family. This independent autopsy revealed something that completely contradicted the initial findings: blunt force trauma to Kendrick's head and neck.
Wait, so the first autopsy missed that entirely? That seems like a pretty big oversight.
It does, and it really raised questions about the thoroughness and perhaps even the objectivity of the initial investigation. If the first autopsy had been conducted properly, wouldn't they have noticed those injuries? The blunt force trauma suggests that Kendrick's death was no accident, and that some kind of violence was involved.
Okay, so that's huge. What else happened that added to the mystery?
Then there's the issue of Kendrick's missing organs. When his body was exhumed for the second autopsy, his family made a horrifying discovery. His organs were missing, and his body cavity had been stuffed with newspaper.
Hold on, his organs were missing. What in the world happened there?
That's the million-dollar question. The authorities tried to blame the funeral home, but the funeral home denied any responsibility, claiming they received the body that way. So where did Kendrick's organs go, and why? Was this a deliberate attempt to conceal evidence? Were the organs examined independently? We simply don't know. And that lack of information only fuels the speculation.
It's like something out of a horror movie. This poor family has been through so much trying to get answers. And this just adds another layer of trauma and confusion to an already heartbreaking situation. And there's the surveillance footage again. Any updates on that?
Unfortunately, no. Key segments of the footage, from the time surrounding Kendrick's disappearance, remain missing. This has been a constant source of frustration. For those seeking justice, without that footage, it's very difficult to piece together what happened that day. Was it a technical malfunction? Or a deliberate attempt to erase evidence? We may never know for sure.
So despite all of this, despite the inconsistencies, the missing evidence, and the public outcry, the case remained closed for years. What happened that changed that?
In 2021, after years of tireless advocacy by Kendrick's family and their supporters, the case was finally reopened, new evidence was submitted, and federal investigators got involved.
That must have given the family some hope. After all this time, what were people expecting to come out of this new investigation?
There was definitely a sense of cautious optimism. People hoped that the new investigation would uncover the truth and finally bring some closure to Kendrick's family. However, it's important to remember that a lot of time had passed. Evidence might have been compromised, witness memories might have faded. It was a long shot, but it was still a chance for justice.
So what happened? Did the reopened investigation lead to any breakthroughs?
Unfortunately, there haven't been any major developments announced publicly. The investigation is ongoing. But it's unclear what, if any, progress has been made. Kendrick's family continues to fight for answers, and they deserve nothing less.
It's a tragedy that this case remains unresolved. After all these years, there are so many unanswered questions. How did Kendrick actually end up inside that mat? Why was the surveillance footage missing? Who did the blood belong to? What happened to his organs? Were authorities trying to protect someone? Why were witnesses' statements so inconsistent?
These are the questions that haunt this case, and they demand answers. The lack of clarity surrounding Kendrick's death is a stark reminder of the complexities of seeking justice and the importance of holding those in power accountable. This case exposes deeper societal issues that we need to confront as a nation, potential flaws in police investigations, the shadow of racial bias, and the relentless fight for justice against seemingly insurmountable odds.
It's a reminder that even in a country that prides itself on justice, the reality can be much more complicated. What do you think this case says about our system and the pursuit of truth and accountability?
I think it highlights the importance of vigilance, skepticism, and demanding transparency from those in positions of authority. It also underscores the need for thorough and impartial investigations, regardless of the victor's race, social status, or any other factor. Kendrick's case is a tragedy, but it can also serve as a catalyst for positive change if we learn from it and work to prevent similar injustices from happening in the future.
Well said. So after this deep dive into the Kendrick Johnson case, I think we're all left with more questions than answers. But hopefully this has shed some light on the complexities of this case and why it continues to resonate with so many people. What's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is that we should never stop questioning, never stop demanding answers, and never stop fighting for justice.
I agree. Kendrick Johnson deserved justice, and his family deserves closure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and thank you for sharing your expertise on this complex and heartbreaking case.
It was my pleasure.
And before we go, I want to remind you all to please like, subscribe, and comment. It really does help this channel. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.